In a world where power is everything and loyalty is nothing more than a fragile illusion, one single night threatens to tear the mighty Newman dynasty apart forever. What begins as a calculated act of vengeance quickly spirals into a nightmare of fire, betrayal, and psychological collapse, dragging every member of the family into a moment where survival is no longer guaranteed and truth can no longer be buried. When a desperate warning from Chelsea Lawson collides with the ruthless instincts of Victor Newman, the stage is set for a confrontation that will expose not only a deadly external threat, but the internal rot that has been festering within the family for years. As flames rise and a deadly explosion orchestrated by Matt Clark engulfs a seemingly ordinary gas station, the illusion of control shatters in an instant. Inside the chaos, Nick Newman is forced to face a truth more terrifying than death itself: his own self-destruction. Sharon Newman stands at the edge of emotional ruin, torn between the instinct to save and the need to finally break free. Adam Newman, long haunted by distrust and rejection, sees in this catastrophe a brutal opportunity to prove his worth or lose everything trying. And Noah Newman, caught in the crossfire of generations, begins to realize that the legacy he once admired may be nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. This is not just a story about survival. It is a descent into the darkest corners of ambition, resentment, and fractured identity, where every choice carries consequences and every bond is tested under unbearable pressure. Because when the fire dies down and the smoke clears, what remains is far more dangerous than the explosion itself. A family forced to confront the truth they have spent years trying to ignore. The night did not begin as a tragedy. It unraveled into one. A single desperate call from Chelsea Lawson tore through the fragile illusion of control that the Newman family had carefully constructed around themselves. Beneath the surface of power, wealth, and calculated dominance, there had always been fractures, hairline cracks formed by betrayal, addiction, pride, and unspoken resentment. That night, under the harsh glare of flickering gas station lights, those fractures finally split open. The trap laid by Matt Clark was not merely an act of revenge. It was a declaration of war against everything the Newmans represented. The gasoline-soaked ground, the carefully sabotaged exits, and the timing of the explosion revealed a mind driven not just by hatred, but by a need to erase an entire legacy. In Matt's distorted logic, destroying the family meant rewriting the balance of power, proving that even the most untouchable dynasty could burn. Inside the chaos, Nick Newman felt something far worse than fear. He felt recognition. The suffocating heat and the suffocating consequences mirrored the internal destruction he had been carrying for months. His addiction had not only weakened him, it had turned him into a liability, a crack in the armor that enemies like Matt could exploit. As flames closed in, Nick was forced to confront the brutal truth that he had become the weakest link in a family built on strength. That realization did not bring clarity. It brought rage. Rage at himself, at his past, and at the silent judgment he believed he saw in the eyes of those around him. Nearby, Sharon Newman was caught between instinct and history. Her survival was not just about escaping the fire. It was about escaping the emotional gravity that kept pulling her back into cycles of pain. Watching Nick struggle triggered a storm of conflicting impulses, compassion battling with exhaustion, loyalty colliding with self-preservation. She had spent years trying to believe that love could fix what was broken, but in that moment, surrounded by flames, she began to question whether staying connected to the Newmans was itself a form of self-destruction. Noah Newman experienced the event differently. For him, the explosion was not just a life-threatening disaster, it was the collapse of an illusion he had carried since childhood. The idea that his family was invincible shattered as he witnessed the vulnerability of those he once saw as unbreakable. Fear quickly transformed into anger, but not the explosive kind. His anger was cold, controlled, and directed inward as much as outward. He began to question every decision that had led them to that moment, every secret that had been hidden from him, and every lie that had been told under the guise of protection. At the center of it all stood Adam Newman, whose survival instinct was sharpened by years of living on the edge of acceptance within his own family. For Adam, the fire was more than a threat. It was a test. A test of loyalty, of identity, and of whether he truly belonged among the people he was risking his life to save. As he navigated the chaos, pulling others to safety while calculating every move. A darker thought took root. If any one of them failed to make it out, would he be blamed? Would he once again become the scapegoat for a tragedy he did not create? That thought did not weaken him. It fueled him. His determination to survive became intertwined with the need to prove his worth, not through words, but through action. Yet even as he fought to save his family, resentment simmered beneath the surface. He could not ignore the irony that he was risking everything for people who had never fully trusted him. The explosion itself was a moment of brutal finality. When the flames erupted and the structure gave way, it seemed to confirm Matt's belief that he had succeeded. From a distance, Sienna Bacall watched in horror, her mind unable to reconcile what she was witnessing. The fire reflected in her eyes became a symbol of the chaos she had helped set in motion, whether knowingly or not. Panic overtook her, but beneath it lay something more dangerous: guilt. She began to realize that survival would not free her from the consequences of her choices. It would trap her in them. And yet, against all logic, the Newmans emerged from the wreckage alive, burned, shaken, but unbroken. Their survival was not a victory. It was a reckoning. The aftermath did not bring relief. It brought confrontation. Away from the flames, in the cold clarity that follows disaster, the emotional fallout began to surface. Adam turned his focus on Nick, no longer willing to ignore the obvious. What had once been unspoken tension erupted into a silent but undeniable pressure. Nick's addiction was no longer a private struggle. It was a threat to everyone around him. Adam's insistence that Nick face it was not purely altruistic. It was driven by a mix of anger, fear, and a need to regain control over a situation that had nearly spiraled beyond saving. Nick resisted, not outwardly, but internally. He saw Adam's concern as judgment, as another reminder of his failure. The more he felt cornered, the more he retreated into himself, clinging to the very behavior that was destroying him. It was a vicious cycle, one that pushed him closer to the edge with every passing moment. Meanwhile, the shadow of Victor Newman loomed over everything. His intervention had saved them, but it also reinforced the power dynamics that defined their lives. Victor's presence was both a shield and a chain. His ability to control outcomes came at a cost: the autonomy of those around him. In the wake of the explosion, that cost became impossible to ignore. Victor's motivation was not purely paternal. Saving his family was also about preserving his legacy, maintaining the image of invincibility that he had spent decades building. The attack by Matt was not just a personal threat, it was an affront to his authority, and Victor did not forgive such challenges. His next moves would not be driven by emotion alone, but by strategy, a calculated effort to ensure that no one would ever dare to challenge him again. For Sharon, the aftermath forced a decision she could no longer postpone. Staying connected to the Newmans meant accepting a life defined by chaos and danger. Leaving meant abandoning people she still cared about. Neither option offered peace. The fire had stripped away any illusions she had about stability, leaving her to confront the reality that survival sometimes required letting go. Noah, caught between generations, began to distance himself emotionally. He recognized the patterns repeating around him, the same cycles of control, rebellion, and destruction, and he refused to be consumed by them. But distancing himself came with its own cost: isolation. The more he pulled away, the more he risked losing any sense of belonging. As for Adam, his gratitude toward Chelsea remained one of the few clear emotions in an otherwise turbulent landscape. Her decision to call Victor had set everything in motion, had tipped the balance between life and death. But even that gratitude was complicated. It forced him to acknowledge how close they had all come to losing everything, and how dependent they still were on forces beyond their control. The fire at the gas station did not end with the flames being extinguished. It continued to burn within each of them, reshaping their relationships, their priorities, and their sense of self. The real damage was not visible in the charred remains of the building, but in the invisible fractures that had deepened within the Newman family. And somewhere in the shadows, the consequences of that night continued to evolve. Because survival, in a world defined by power and betrayal, was never the end of the story. It was only the beginning of something far more dangerous.